About a year ago, I made a video on Outlast, a game that I hold very close to my heart since I practically grew up playing it, which explains why I ended up the way I did. The video did pretty good, and I got loads of comments asking about my thoughts on the sequel. I answered those comments already, but decided to make a video on it anyway, cause I was out of ideas. I remember when Outlast 2 was first announced. Being the massive Outlast fan that I am, I was counting days until I could get my hands on it. Red Barrels were hyping it up as the scariest thing in the universe back then. So much so that they made diapers for the promotional video.
Introducing our Kickstarter project, Underscare's Outlast 2 diapers. Oh yeah, they're real.
Which was genius, to be honest. But the game itself, I always felt conflicted on it. Not to sound like these guys here, I got my own points to make as well. Like I said in my Outlast video, which you should totally watch after this, Outlast was a very simple game, mechanically and everything. So, where could Red Barrels go from there? Another asylum? That would be the same game all over again. They took the psychological approach this time, which led to half the community still confused about the story to this day.
What's it all mean?
So, even though everyone knows it already, let's give the game a proper retrospective anyway. We play as Blake Langerman. Not a journalist this time, but a camera guy, so the camera thing is still justified. We come to this forest in the middle of nowhere to report some news with our wife Lynn, until a massive white light knocked our chopper down, and now we gotta start looking for Lynn.
Find Lynn. Nothing matters but Lynn.
As you just heard, our character can actually speak this time. Unlike Miles, who was a mute, Blake is an actual character with an actual personality.
A murder victim. Hey, Lynn, I don't think you should say murdered. We don't know that.
Oh, I'll say she strangled herself to death.
Not that that's necessarily a good thing, but we'll get back to that later. First things first, this game is absolutely gorgeous. Outlast looked pretty good relative to its time and budget, but this game looks amazing, even with today's standards. After the game runs us through the basic tutorial section, teaching us how to walk and jump, etc., we reach a creepy looking village called Templegate. This is the setting of the sequel. Instead of the overrun asylum, we now have a cult-infested town in the middle of the woods. It's basically RE4, but I'm okay with that. After being chased and beaten by the villagers, we hide in the middle of a cornfield. But the villagers come inside looking for us as well. This part is one of the highlights of the sequel and uses the new setting and mechanics really well. The villagers can't see you, but you can't see them either. In Outlast 2, our camera has the brand new feature to pick up sounds, which shows the direction of the mumbling cultists, helping you avoid them before it's too late. In the reviews, everyone mentions how useless this feature is. I tried my hardest to get as much use as I can out of it, but honestly, outside of a handful of sections, it won't come to any use. The most iconic part of Outlast was the villain roster. This game has villains too, they just aren't as memorable. Early on in the game, we encounter Martha for the first time. Martha is supposed to be Chris Walker's replacement for Outlast 2. She follows us throughout the game and does a decent job at being menacing, but honestly, she can't replace Chris for me. Also, I don't like how she one-shots us every time. That's not scary, that's annoying. Who else? Val. Val is the leader of the Heretics, a group of animalistic wild Satanists who completely gave in to their desires and want to see the world burn. They are only slightly worse than the God-fearing Christians in this game. Val isn't really menacing herself, but the Heretics are really scary. After being chased out of the village, we find a camp full of these sick, dying, diseased villagers. These are called the Scalled, a faction of the cultists who were kicked out because they have STDs. It's actually a real thing, you can look it up. They don't pose a threat by the looks of it, that is until we meet their leaders, Nick and Laird. I love these guys. Laird is this little guy with a bow on top of this massive brute carrying a lantern who is Nick. They look so goofy and comical until they capture us, crucify us, and bury us alive.
Don't! Please don't! Please don't! Please.
Apart from being the most unique looking characters in the franchise, their whole part of the game is one of the major highlights. Laird can shoot arrows at you, which you have to dodge from like it's a first person shooter, and Nick can kick doors in with one hit. Pretty scary stuff. After we get away from them, it starts raining blood. It's an amazing visual, but it shows that Blake is going insane. We move to the mines to get Lynn back from the heretics, since they stole her from the cultists. The mine is another highlight of the game. Fresh from the open outdoor areas of the forest, we enter this claustrophobic mine, where it's tight and dark, and infested with heretics. Eventually we find Lynn, and she's suddenly become pregnant in one day. After she gives birth to the Antichrist, as she would naturally, she dies, and the world ends. And that's it. That's the overall story of Outlast 2. If you ignore all the notes lying around filled with exposition, this is the explanation the game gives you. Outlast 1 had a simple story. Just by observing the world around you, you could piece things together. But this time around, you gotta read all of those notes if you wanna understand anything. Or you could just do what everyone else did and watch one of these videos. Basically, it's Murkoff again. The reason why the world ends at the end, or why it was raining blood, or just anything of that nature, was just that. They were hallucinations. Oh, and speaking of hallucinations... the school sections. Easily the most divisive part of the sequel. Half of the community think it's the best part of the game, and the other half hates it. I fall somewhere in the middle. From the first 5 minutes of the game, you can already guess where the story is going. Religious school, mysterious man, screaming girl, blood, in a horror game as well. If you haven't already figured it out, you're in luck, cause the game will slowly unravel this story across a third of the runtime. But if you have, you gotta sit there as the game beats you over the head with it. Throughout the game, Blake constantly sees hallucinations of his childhood school. But from the beginning, it's clear that these school sections aren't real. If you record anything in there, the recording just shows up as static, with scrambled audio. The school revolves around the story of a girl named Jessica, who apparently took her own life. The game gives you subtle hints about it at the beginning, but the more time you spend in there, the less subtle those hints get. But there's more to this story than what meets the eye. If you look around the school for clues, or if you have any common sense, it becomes pretty obvious that Jessica was abused in here.
She was so ripe with possibility, so resilient, smiling and flirting, never even aware of the power she had.
With that realization, we finally get to see what actually happened to her. The ending of the game has two variations based on our findings in game. If Blake realizes what actually happened in that school, at the end we see Jessica just fine. But if he doesn't, we see her with rope burns around her neck. Meaning, we never found out the truth, and it just remains a repressed memory. Now, story-wise, I like this. It connects with the whole corrupt power aspect of the Outlast franchise. But gameplay-wise, these parts suck, dude. Everything that happens in that school is completely scripted. Every event, every story beat, and every chase. If you play the game once, you have nothing new to get from it. This on top of the already predictable story, and these parts become a chore to get through. The school is the worst offender when it comes to this, but really this goes for the majority of the game. If you try to hide from most of the enemies in-game, they would just rush to your location immediately. Because they're not programmed to look for you. They're programmed to chase you. Outlast 1 was mostly sneaking around and tending to the objectives. Outlast 2 is mostly a thrill ride with dozens of scripted chases and set pieces. And I don't like that as much. I already talked about what I liked and what I disliked about the game. But there's a handful of things that I consider missed opportunities. There's a really cool section in one of the first scripted chases where we realize the enemies in Outlast 2 can crouch in tight spaces. which was a big surprise since the patients in Outlast 1 couldn't do that. I wish they would have done more stuff like that. How cool would it have been to enter a room thinking you're safe just to have an enemy pop out of a locker or something like that? Just to subvert our expectations. The heretics are the scariest enemies in game, but they behave exactly like the regular villagers. It would have been much more interesting if they had, I don't know, limited vision but a better sense of hearing. And it will make more sense as well, cause their whole face is covered in mud. That could have offered some variety in the gameplay. Maybe have the player be careful not to step on any glass or make any noise. But instead, we get another forced chase section. Overall, some unique ideas could have helped out a lot. Anything to keep things from being too predictable. There's a surprising amount of rehashed plot points and set pieces in Outlast 2. You might have noticed how everyone compares Marta to Chris. It's because that's what she is! They specifically designed her as the replacement to Chris Walker, and as a result, she feels hollow as her own character. I'm not saying Chris was a multi-layered, complex character by any means, but at least he was unique back when we first encountered him. If you really think about it, you can draw a lot of parallels between these new characters and the older ones. In some ways, the Whistleblower DLC was much more innovative than Outlast 2. Eddie Gluskin wasn't anything like the other characters. He was his own brand of terrifying, and most fans consider him the scariest to this day. The biggest change Outlast 2 brings to the table is in its religious themes, and I gotta say, I have no idea where the devs were going with this. What is the message of this game? What is this supposed to say? All of the enemies we've encountered so far die very suddenly and conveniently right before they were gonna kill Blake. Almost as if some sort of higher power is intervening. At the end of the game, it's not even subtle, but like, what is this implying? So there is an actual higher power letting all of this happen? If it doesn't intervene then, why intervene now? Is there even any thought put behind any of this? Or did they just include these stuff cause the cross and the logo looked cool? Honestly, I don't know. Looking back on how I responded to the Outlast 2 comments, I still agree with everything, but grew to appreciate the sequel a lot more since that video. On my Outlast video, I had some commenters that preferred Outlast 2 to 1, like this guy who had some valuable arguments to make. I'd like to make it clear that I don't dislike Outlast 2, and I don't think Outlast 2 is a bad game. When I first played Outlast 2 years ago, back when it just came out, I felt weird about it. It was a good game, I could tell, but it just didn't feel the same. I didn't exactly know why at the time, and maybe I still don't, but this is as close as I can get to it with words. Ultimately, that's all I had to say about it. Sorry if this took too long. Subscribe, please.